These monthly meetings are brought to you by three organizations: the Judson Memorial Church, in which you are sitting, the Left Forum, and I'm very pleased to announce, for those of you that have been asking, that the Left Forum now has a specific date and a specific place. So those of you that are interested and know what that is, it will take place on the 20th, 21st, and 22nd of May, 2016, at the John Jay College of the City University of New York. It usually brings between 4,500 and 5,000 people. That's what we expect this coming May. And that is the second organization that supports these monthly events. And the third one is Democracy at Work. That's the one that I work most with. And that produces the weekly radio show, Economic Update, that some of you hear. You can hear it here in New York on WBAI, Fridays at 9 o'clock. And you can also see it on WMNN television in Manhattan, Tuesday evening at 8 o'clock. I believe that's channel 34 on your dial if you're interested. It's the same thing, it's just one is the television version and one is the radio version. I want to remind those of you that are watching the video around the world that those folks gathered here have each very kindly contributed $10 to help make these things possible. The video is available globally to everyone on the internet, but it would be very nice if those of you who watch it would also contribute the same $10, which you can do by going to our websites, rdwolff with 2fs.com or Democracy at Work, all one word, democracyatwork.info. There's a donate button there, and your $10 will help pay for all the costs of videoing and distributing and all the rest that we do. Last announcement. We have partnered, Democracy at Work has, we have partnered recently with a firm. They're friends of ours, but they're also a firm that is engaged and has been for years in converting top-down, hierarchical, capitalist enterprises into worker co-ops. As you know, we talk a good bit about that, and I'm part of a movement of trying to develop that as an alternative way of organizing the economy for the kinds of reasons we talk about here on these Wednesday nights. But up until recently, it was mostly just explaining why capitalism is having the growing problems it has. You're going to see a lot of that tonight. And talking about worker co-ops as an alternative, as a solution, if you like, to the growing problems of a system that I do think is dying and needs to have something come next so that we don't die with it. But we only advocated until now because we didn't have the time or the expertise to sit down with groups of people that are actually interested in making the transition from one kind of enterprise to another. We now have that capability, so I want you to know it, and I want people watching this to know this is a firm that works with us. It includes lawyers, accountants, credit specialists who have a long history in knowing precisely how to take an existing enterprise that is organized in the traditional way and transform it so that the workers in it, collectively and democratically, own and operate it, run it. They become their own board of directors in their company. That has been going on for thousands of years. It's not a new phenomena, but it's taking on a new meaning and a new importance in the current conjuncture. So we're very pleased to be able to offer that. Get in touch with us. Again, use the websites. Get in touch with us. If you work in an enterprise, and by the way, whether you are a worker in it or you are the employer in it, we work with both. You might be surprised how many employers, especially now in the United States, as they get to retirement age, really don't want to continue in their business, and for whatever reason, their children are not interested in that line of life. So they now have a big, difficult decision. They can close the business, but they just spent a lifetime pouring themselves into it. They don't often want to do that. And they could sell it to a big, faceless corporation. They don't want to do that either because they don't know what that is going to happen with what they've created. But they realize, with a little help from us often, that if you could sell it to your workers. They have a commitment to that business because, like you, they've poured themselves into it for a long time. They know it. They know how to work it. They know it a lot better than you've often given them credit for. And now, with some expert help, we're able to tell them that in many states in the United States, that kind of a conversion is easy to do, fully legal, and ends up leaving the people who sell the business to their workers with a less of a tax bite on the sale they make than if they sold it to a regular corporation. So the irony is, there's lots of reasons to do this, not just the one we advocate for. So if any of you are interested, get in touch with us and we will connect you to that firm which does that work. Okay, let's then jump into tonight's monthly economic update. I should remind you, with the help of the music, that you should turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices, particularly those of you that might be recording any of this for a governmental agency. Okay. It's not really a laughing matter. On the other hand, you know, you got to laugh to keep from crying about such things. All right. Even though it's very recent and we try to take a look at what happened over the last month, I really have to bring to your attention, which I suspect for many of you isn't necessary, but I'm going to do it anyway, the very remarkable events of the last few days in Columbia, Missouri. If you did not notice, you should, because something there happened that is a straw in the wind, and no minor one either. For those of you that were busy and didn't catch it, even though it got quite a bit of publicity, let me quickly remind you. The University of Missouri, the main campus is in Columbia, Missouri, and like many universities in this country in recent years, it decided under weird circumstances, that is, the usual ones, weird circumstances, that it could improve a lot of its performance as a university if it was run like a business. There seem to be an awful lot of people who think that if everything is run like a business, it will do a lot better than if it isn't run like a business, even if it isn't in fact a business. And what tends to happen is if you run something like a business, it becomes more like a business, which, if you're a university, is at best a mixed event. University of Massachusetts, I was about to say, it's where I taught. The University of Missouri, in this case, brought in a businessman who could be better equipped to run it like a business. And he proceeded to do that, displaying what is usually the real issue, which has nothing to do with business. It has to do with cutting costs. But it doesn't sound good that we're going to bring somebody in who's going to fire a lot of people and reduce the quantity of toilet paper in the bathroom. That doesn't sound so good. Doesn't even sound so positive. Whereas running it like a business, that sounds much better. You know, it's the American desire to convert the bus driver into a transportation engineer and things like that. So we're going to run the University of Missouri like a business. And one of the first creative acts of a Mr. Wolff, no relation, spells it differently, who was the head of the university, was to take medical insurance away from all of the graduate students doing the teaching and the adjuncts. This is cute. This is a clear improvement in the quality of education, don't you think? Teachers are going to do a much better job in the classroom if they have nowhere to go when they get sick because they can't afford a doctor. This brilliant move saved money, which is, of course, what running it like a business is. By the way, the running it like a business is cute also because when the workers, the employees of a university, now being run like a business, decide to join a union, which is what workers in businesses do, they get a big lecture from the university about how we don't need to have a union in a citadel of learning. It stops being a business when that would be raising the costs. It's really only a business if you cut the cost. So they did. They cut the graduate student. That made the graduate students rather unhappy. And the same fellow, suggesting a link that you might want to think about in your life, the same fellow was remarkably unactive when it came to dealing with clear examples of racial discrimination and racial prejudice directed particularly against African Americans among the students, who brought complaints about various events to his attention. But he was so busy taking the medical insurance away from the teachers that he had no time or space to deal with the complaints of students describing incidents on the campus that anybody who isn't strange would have realized demand a lot of attention and not to be ignored. But he ignored that in the way that business-run universities tend to do. That was a big mistake. Two things happened. A growing number of students, black and white, got upset about his not doing anything about these events. One of them went on a hunger strike, saying that he wasn't going to eat anything until this president was out of there. And everybody scoffed in that nervous way people do when they don't like something that's happening, but they don't really know what to do about it. And so it sat for a few days, this fellow getting sick. I mean, he wasn't eating anything. And then an even more interesting thing happened. The African American athletes on the football team at the University of Missouri got together and announced, first to their coach, I believe the coach is white. Yes? Okay, so the coach is white. Announced to the coach that they were thinking of protesting, and they had an interesting way of doing it. They wouldn't play football anymore for the University of Missouri. This was stunning. They got themselves together, those students, and they did that. And they confronted the coach, and that meant the coach now, and I'm being a professor all my life, I know how this game is played. The coach is in the middle. Now he's getting the pressure from the students that are his athletes and his team, and that's his career. And he's an agent of the administration who's supposed to, and he has to make one of those great choices that you hope you don't have too often in your life. And that man had the courage, and he made his choice. He went with the students. And he announced that he was with the students, there would be no more University of Missouri football games. Now you're going to learn about how a university nowadays really is a business. Because that's how universities now make a lot of their money. By bringing people to the stadium to watch the football games, by signing contracts with the television stations to broadcast the football. And now they had found the weak link of the run the business university like a business. They said, okay, you're going to play that way. We're going to let you learn something. It's a lesson that applies to all businesses. If the workers don't do it, you don't have a business. The minute workers understand that, the power relations in our society are turned on their head. Those who have it discover they don't have it, and those who never thought they had it discover they do have it. That's why it's a very dangerous moment. In 24 hours, the president of the University of Missouri was gone. The board told him, you have a lovely choice, Mr. President. You have, 40, 50 minutes to resign, or we're going to bounce you out of here. He chose to resign because that's less dangerous for his career. But nobody is fooled. He resigned because the people upon whom that university depends for its money, the students, first and foremost, the faculty, which had mobilized because the senior faculty had empathized with the graduate students. After all, they're students who had no more medical coverage because of this business genius in his way of running the university. But the important historical thing is, it's like a parable. It's like a Bible story, what we're listening and we're watching here. The people rose up and they said, no more of this. And the people in charge said, we will do what, we'll run like a business. Yeah, okay, bye-bye, you're gone. And nobody quite knows. It's in the front pages of a lot of newspapers. It got a lot of attention because even the people who like to keep these stories secret were struck by how fast it all went. Once the lines were clear, boom! The people with the power had none, and the people with no power had just won what they set out to win. Will not be quickly forgotten, and you can be very sure in every college athletic program, nothing else is being discussed but that. And in many of the universities, my colleagues have been flooding me with emails talking about this, trying to understand how it's possible, or in the case of, since they know who I am, begging me to explain to them why it hasn't already happened in their university, as they hope it will, and as they will now make a little contribution to having that happen too. So it's a remarkable thing. Since it's about sports, I thought I'd stay with the sports for a minute, because it gives me a chance to tell you another sports story, which is I don't do very often, but I should do it more. And a sports story in which I get to quote Senator John McCain. Not a fellow gets a lot of attention in these Wednesday evenings, as you know. So I want to do that. I had somehow kind of begun to forget who he was, so this brings him back to us. So here was the issue. Senator John McCain, together with another senator, Jeff Flake, there's something very deeply meaningful that a senator is named Flake, but you know, Jeff Flake is a Republican senator from Arizona. The Flake and Mr. McCain, a duo, have been running an investigation since 2012 into what they call paid patriotism. This is a lovely story. And you could, once I tell you, you'll see why it would catch my attention and why I would tell you about it. It turns out that the Defense Department of the United States of America has dished out over $7 million in the last few years to buy and pay for demonstrations of patriotism at professional sports events. You're going to love this. And I'm going to spell out for you because I really want you to get what's at stake here. But before I do, I want to give you the specifics. These are contracts the senators noted, Senators McCain and Flake, involving the Army National Guard, which stipulated in the contract what they wanted: on-field color guard, enlistment and re-enlistment ceremonies, performances of the national anthem, full field flag details. I don't even know what these things are, but I'm assuming some of you do. Ceremonial first pitches and puck drops, and hometown hero and wounded warrior tributes. So when you've seen those on a football game or a basketball game or a hockey game, I want you to think about this. That display, you paid for that. You're watching a performance your money was used to display to you. As examples, the U.S. Air Force paid the Cincinnati Bengals $5,000 for 60 club-level tickets to their games. The Atlanta Falcons were paid by the Pentagon to recognize wounded warriors and to have a National Guard member sing the national anthem in uniform. Theater, the theater of patriotism that you paid for. The New York Jets, we're in New York, were paid $20,000 to honor the New Jersey National Guard members at every home game. Here's the one I like best. The Milwaukee Brewers paid $49,000 to sponsor performances of God Bless America. These expressions of deep patriotism were undertaken for profit. I want to read to you now from Senator John McCain. Quote, Americans across the country should be deeply disappointed that many of the ceremonies honoring troops at professional sporting events are not actually being conducted out of a sense of patriotism, but for profit in the form of millions of taxpayer dollars going from the Department of Defense to wealthy pro-sports franchises. Senator John McCain. It's not the man we knew running for whatever that office was that he was interested in. Now, what's the economics here? It's real simple. The Defense Department gets a lot of money from the United States Congress every year, many, many billions of dollars. In order to keep that spigot open, in order to keep that money running, they've got to have hoopla in the country about how we love our troops and how we support them. I mean, today is Veterans Day, isn't it? There was a parade on Fifth Avenue here in New York to honor the veterans. But our Defense Department is not leaving anything to chance. It doesn't trust that the American people actually care about any of this. So we have to have paid theatrics portrayed to the American people as if the sports team or the athletes themselves or the stadium was so moved by this situation to express. Now you know. They weren't moved. That's what moved them. The only difference is you have to understand that you paid for the theater to enable them to get more money out of you for the theater. That's what the theater was for. Your money to give you the illusion that would sustain your willingness to have your representatives continue to give them more money. They're not leaving it to chance. They're learning about advertising. Okay, next item. There are big changes happening in Europe, and they are going to affect us. There are actually quite a few. I want to mention a couple of them and bring them to your attention. We're going to be talking about them in the future. Europe is angry that a number of countries in Europe have been doing something which the other countries in Europe are upset about. The countries in question are places like Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, other places you never heard of because they're really about the size of a suburb. But they're independent countries, some of them. And they do basically a little game. Some of them are a little bit bigger. Ireland is a bad example of this. What they do is they artificially reduce the rules and regulations governing how you can locate your business on paper in their country. And having located your business there, even if what you produce is elsewhere in the world, and even if most of what you sell is to people elsewhere in the world, if there's an office through which the paperwork goes, located in Ireland or located in Luxembourg, you get to declare the profits you earned as having been earned there. And why would you do that? Because the tax rates there are very, very low. And so you get out of paying the high taxes where you actually produce the stuff, or the high taxes where you actually make the revenue from selling the stuff. You get instead to declare your income and pay the taxes where you are, it's called domiciled, where your paperwork says your headquarters are. Even if you have a secretary and a post office box and an office the size of a closet. It doesn't matter if you've done the paperwork. The Cayman Islands in this part of the world play that role. The Bahamas in certain way, the islands in the Caribbean, and so on. Anyway, the Europeans are angry. The Germans, the French are suffering because they are losing huge amounts of taxes. I'm going to give you an example in a minute of the amounts of money involved. According to the Citizens for Tax Justice, that's a very established and well-respected research outfit. Let's see, companies now hold over 2.1 trillion, with a T, trillion offshore, on which they owe an estimated $620 billion in federal taxes. This is in the United States. So our government is out $620 billion. That's an enormous amount of money. But we're not going to get it. That is, our government isn't going to get it. Which means our government, because it can't get that money from these companies that are domiciled out there, that means they have two choices. They have three choices. One, they can tax the rest of us to make up from us what they're not getting from those companies. They do that. Second choice, they can just cut government services. They're not getting the money they need to help students or pay for food stamps or keep the roads going, and so they don't. And the third one is to borrow what they can't raise in taxes from these companies, and that's really cute because if you trace through how that works, they end up borrowing the money from those companies who didn't have to pay the taxes, giving these companies the following giggle on the way to the bank. We just got an opportunity to substitute a loan to the United States government, which they have to give us back and pay us interest while we sit on it, instead of being taxed. Take us about 2.5 seconds to choose that way. A choice you don't have, but you're not a corporation, which shows that, you didn't go to the University of Missouri. I want to read to you the names of some of the companies that have the top amounts of money squirreled away in these places. Because you've heard of some of these companies. They are as American as apple pie, motherhood, and maple syrup. I'm going to read them in the order of the size. The largest one by far, the real hero, is the Apple Computer Company. They are stunning. They are followed by the following: Google, PepsiCo, Pfizer Drugs, Microsoft, Morgan Stanley Bank, Nike, and American Express. As I often say to you, if we had more time, I could stop now and we just play the national anthem and take a break. The Europeans are not going to allow this. And they have already now moved against two companies that each are going to have to pay a penalty of $30 million. Now, that may sound like a lot to you, but for them, that's not very much. But it's a sign of which way the wind is blowing. So I want to let you know the two companies that have now been fined in Europe as they begin to move in on this problem. The first one is Starbucks, and the second one, the Fiat Chrysler Corporation, the combination of those two. There's a wrinkle here. And why do I bring it up? Because under the United States tax law, a company in America can not only lower its taxes paid to Washington by setting up an office in Ireland or Luxembourg, but if they ever have to pay taxes in any of those countries, they can deduct from the taxes owed to the United States the money that they're paying over there. So the Europeans are beginning to do something, and the net result for the United States is that these corporations will pay even less than they already were, because they're going to be able to deduct what they pay in the United States for the fact that they're finally being required to pay something in Europe. You can't make this stuff up. What's going to happen and how this is going to play out and what kind of tensions between the United States and Europe are going to be built up around this, believe me, we will be paying attention to it in the time to come. Okay, another story over the last month. This is partly done to scare you. Boeing, the country makes the airplanes and all of that, settled in the last month, that's why we're doing it now, settled a case and paid a fine of $57 million. What did they do this time? Oh, this is really wonderful. Boeing agreed to pay $57 million, and by the way, a few months ago, a bit more was paid by Lockheed Martin, another major defense contractor, because of excessive fees charged to the workers' 401k retirement funds. In other words, more and more workers, many of you I'm sure covered, you don't get the traditional pensions anymore. You basically are set up with a 401k, that's a paragraph in the Internal Revenue Service rules, and money is put aside, taken out of your check and maybe contributed by your employer, and that's your pension building up. But of course it then is given to a management company, in-house or somebody outside, and it turns out that for 20 years, the management company in cahoots with your employer has been cooking the books and charging way more fees than they should have. And after a 9-year legal battle, they got caught. Those of you that have 401ks, think about it. All right. Moving right along, and I'm worried because some of these are going to get you down, but you always have that option. You don't have to come here on Wednesday night. Just turn on the TV and it'll all be much better. Either that or take some chemical substance, but I can't go into that. My next topic is the Whole Foods Corporation. They've been in the news in the last month. They got themselves into trouble. In California, they got themselves into trouble, and here in New York City, Whole Foods got itself into trouble. And it turns out it got into trouble in this last summer in California, and more recently in New York City, for incorrectly weighing the packaged food that you bought. You thought you were getting 11 ounces, but you weren't. You were getting a smaller number. It said 11 ounces, and you, being trusting folk, thought it might be, but it wasn't. Over and over again. California, they had to pay $800,000 in fine, Whole Foods. That's like you're doing something really unpleasant and my insisting that you immediately pay a dime for your bad behavior. Get the dime out, no amount, I will not listen to you, a dime. And you will look at me, a dime? Yes, a dime. And you'll get out a dime and you'll leave wondering what's the matter with me. But it's at least a sign of something, because mostly the government doesn't even do that. 800,000, and here in New York. Also, they got caught. This is very old. Those of you know the story, the ancient stories that when the butcher in the old days would take a piece of meat, he would put it on the scale, but he'd leave his finger right next to it, pressing down a little. So it would say 1.5 pounds, but half of that extra half pound was his thumb or pinky pushing down on the scales. Well, they're a modern outfit. They don't have a butcher weighing things. It's all done by computer, and so you get screwed that way. The head of the Whole Foods is an interesting man, and I wanted to introduce him to you. He bears certain resemblance to Mr. Wolff at the University of Missouri. You can see it's going to be a theme all night. John Mackey has been famous. He's the head of the Whole Foods Corporation. It's based in Texas. He's a major critic in this country of the minimum wage. His business sense tells him there shouldn't be a minimum wage. He hates Obamacare. He's compared Obamacare, he got himself into some difficulty. He compared it to a liberal kind of fascism. So the man doesn't beat around the bush kind of. No. Obamacare is like fascism. you know, like a fish is like a bicycle kind of thing, you know. And I love his choice of words. He was discussing recently global warming, and he said, quote, "Not that big a deal." So the business leader of the Whole Foods Corporation is a deeply committed nut. And you overpay when you go into his store, according to the inspectors of California and New York. And he gets awards, as does that store, for their contribution to the business culture of our society. Here's a really serious one. The fellow who got the Nobel Prize in economics this year is a man named Deaton, D-E-A-T-O-N. Some of you may have noticed a month or two back when he got the award. He and his wife, a woman named Chase, did some research recently which got some play, and I want to make sure you all hear about it. Was covered in a number of business publications like the Financial Times and other. There has been a spike in the suicide rates and the drug dependency rates of middle-aged white men and women in this country. A real statistical, you know, jump. So much so that a whole host of people are scurrying, trying to understand, you know, what's going on. Got quite a bit of play, and various arguments were given as to why it might be. So I thought I'd weigh in and give you some arguments as an economist of what I might say contributes. Obviously, what I'm about to say is not the only factor. Things like that never happen without there being lots of things that come together to make them happen. But let's review. This so-called recovery that we're supposed to be in has bypassed most people. That's going to mean double kinds of tension. First, you're still stuck with all kinds of problems because of what happened in 2008, But it's doubly problematic for you because you live in a society that keeps telling you there's a recovery. You haven't participated, and being a good American, you probably blame yourself for having somehow not done what you should have done, could have done, might have done, ought to have done in order to participate in what seems to be the good news for everybody else, but you aren't in the good news. That's a very hard thing to do. It's a kind of a double whammy. You're not getting a recovery, and you're made to feel very bad about yourself as part of this situation. Then when we look a little more closely, we get even more kinds of scary evidence. It turns out that some of the people with the best jobs lost those jobs. And a lot of those people were middle-aged white people who had gotten in, for a whole host of reasons, into these good jobs, which were wiped out. And they were basically presented with the following. You're never, because you're 47 years old and they're not going to hire you because you're 47 and they can get someone who's 28 or whatever it is. So you're never going to get a job like that again. Not with that responsibility, not with those perks, not with that package, not with none of those things. You're just not going to get that. And here's what you can do. You can get a job, way less money, way less prestige, way less security. That's there. You can get that. But you have to accept all of that, what that implies. You can't live in the same way or place that you used to. You can't go out to dinner when you think it might be nice to do. Or at least, you know, you're going to develop a whole new appreciation for Denny's, something like that. That's your life, you know, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. So I don't mean to be disrespectful for Denny's. I have no respect for Denny's, but I don't mean to be disrespectful for Denny's. And there is another option that these folks are choosing, and this I think is the most important. One of the statistics that nobody quite understands is something called the labor force participation rate. It's the percentage of people at all ages who have opted out of the workforce. Then it's not that they aren't employed, it's that they're not looking. They're out. Well, a large number of them turn out to be people who aren't happy about this situation. They're sitting at home watching daytime television. That's in the afternoon before they go to Denny's. See? And the combination of afternoon television and Denny's, that would kill anybody. And so to make the suffering shorter, they kind of take it into their own hands, or they imbibe substances that are not good for them. Seriously, though, not the least victim of an economic system like ours are the people that are now behaving in a way that they become visible to us as the suicide rates and the drug dependencies go up. It's also a very important lesson for those who hadn't figured out before what some of the major causes are for all the different parts of our population that take too many drugs, that become dependent on drugs. It has a lot to do with being unable to get a decent job, to have the kind of life that goes with the income associated with a decent job, the prestige, the sense of yourself, all of those things, which mean that in a rational society, having a person doing a useful thing in the community is something that ought to be done as a right of life and not be dependent on whether somebody can make profit off your being in that situation. Capitalism doesn't give you a job unless someone makes profit off of it. That's a very strange way to handle this and may explain a good part of these remarkable numbers. Okay. The last short one before we go into the ones that were scheduled, the major ones for tonight, that I don't want to give short shrift to, has to do with this extraordinary story of the Volkswagen German automobile. You really have to take your hat off, your shirt off, your shoes, your socks. It's staggering. First of all, you should all understand, that's the largest automobile company. That's the dominant industrial juggernaut, really, in Germany, and it has been for a very long time. Volkswagen in Germany, Volks is people, Wagen is vehicle. It's like, in English, it should be called the people's car. But because of the Cold War, we couldn't possibly in America have something called the people's car. It would have been, especially if it was painted red, it would have been too much. So we held on to the German name, which Americans can't pronounce anyway. So we couldn't handle that, so it became the VW, because of the two letters, we got that. So it's VW. Okay, so VW. What did they do? Just to remind you, they inserted into the automobile a specialized piece of computer software that managed to give a phony result as to how much pollution was coming out of the car from the back, an exhaust pipe, a gizmo that would cheat, would give a phony low result of pollution when it was subjected to the normal inspector's tests, whereas when you actually went on the road and drove with it, it actually gave out much, much more pollution. And they got caught when a number of people here in the United States, but also elsewhere, had a really exciting idea for an inspector. Here it goes. Ready? Smart, these folks are. Maybe we should check how the emissions go when the car is actually on the road, not just in the lab. Just a thought. Some genius, really, went to Harvard or something. Had this, did it, and they went and they said, wow, it's much worse on the road than it showed up in the lab. And they got caught. And so the first admission, which happened about a month or so ago, 11 million cars, of which I think 500,000 or somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million are here in the United States, diesel engines. When the story begins, it's just diesel engines. It turns out it wasn't just diesel engines. It was that they had only caught them at that point on the diesel engines. Since then, since we don't have a lot of time tonight, I'm here to tell you they got caught again, and it was happening for the gasoline engines also. So VW did what? VW produced millions of cars which it advertised with two basic themes. We Germans are engineering geniuses, and we have produced the best car engine ever. It is spectacular in moving the vehicle, and because we are such geniuses, it doesn't pollute. All the other people either have a car that runs, but it pollutes everything, or they avoid pollution, but their car has no zip. We have zip in our car. It's a German word, Fahrvergnügen. It's a German word that means you have the enjoyment of driving enjoyment. Fahren is the German word for driving, basically, and Vergnügen is enjoyment. So you get the enjoyment of a car because we're so good at it. It was all, to use a technical German term, bullshit. You know, all bullshit, but it worked. For those of you who don't want me to use impolite words, I'll change it. It was all advertising. Advertising is, if you don't want to say bullshit, because it's impolite, you say advertising. Bus driver, transportation engineer. Bullshit, advertising. They advertised a zippy car that didn't pollute. They were right about the zippy. It's zippy. It pollutes like crazy. 11 million cars. Right? People die of asthma, emphysema, children, old people, people with damaged immune systems, all of the things. We're not fooling around here. We're talking huge amounts of pollution into societies. The worst of it was the largest number of these cars were in Germany. So you can see they had a special feeling for the German people out of which they come. They really whacked them first and hardest. Second were the Japanese, their allies in World War II. Strange. And then we come third or fourth down the line. It's bizarre. And they got rid of their chairman, as if. And they're having, you gotta love this, they're having an intense internal investigation to find out who did this. I know. I can save you time and money. No decision about putting such a thing in a car is made by anybody who isn't crazy without checking that they're superior, since their job and career will be over in 2 seconds if this gets out. This is amazing. Now, I told you last month or the month before when it first broke that this is not the first time this happened. VW did this even though the Ford Econoline van back in the 1990s got caught doing exactly the same thing. So the car industry knows this game. The inspectors from the governments know the game. You have to love that it took decades since the last time this was found for an inspector to discover that maybe we should check to see whether what we know they have done in the past, they just might be doing again. You can't. You cannot make this up. Now, what is it about? This is a culture, folks. This is a culture of corporate. This is when we run everything like a business. That's business. It's good business. They did very well in the last 9 or 10 or 12 years, VW. Very well. They have a big program in China where they're producing cars, et cetera, et cetera. They're doing very, very well. They used the ecology movement. Great. We'll tell a story about the idea that the story should be true. It didn't occur to them. It's, no, it's good it's good to advertise your car as being protective of nature. We respect the environment. What? It's all bullshit. Excuse me. It's advertising. They did advertise whatever they could think of to sell the car, which is the job of advertising. And they produced these disasters. And now, the last step. They've offered all Americans who possess one of these cars $1,000. And they hope that Americans will accept $1,000 per car to look the other way and hope it's not too long before they get caught again. Okay, let me turn to the major ones, even though I have half a dozen more of these. One more. The University of Colorado. Today's about universities, isn't it? University of Colorado returned $1 million given to it. It returned it. I can tell you, as a professor all my life, a university that gives back money, this is rare. You really have to do something stunning to get a university so nervous about its image that it'll actually give the money back. So, to whom did the University of Colorado return $1 million? The Coca-Cola Company. They did that too. So now I'm hoping you're wondering with me. It's okay? I hope you're wondering with me what it was that made the University of Colorado give money back to Coca-Cola. And the answer is that Coca-Cola has been funding a variety of medical research outfits around the United States, a whole bunch of them. Only one of which was at the University of Colorado, but I am able to tell you that other universities receiving money from Coca-Cola have begun to return it too. So Coca-Cola's balance sheet will be looking better because money they thought they had spent is coming back. In the case of Colorado, the money went to support something called, and pay attention, this is advertising, the Global Energy Balance Network. The global, what? I'll do it again. The Global Energy Balance Network. People are paid big bucks to come up with this sort of bullshit. Okay? Not you and me, perhaps, but there are. Madison Avenue isn't that far. Okay. Here it is. The big activity of the Global Energy Balance Network, led by a Dr. Blair. This is all from the New York Times on November 7th. So if you ever want to look it up, you can find it there. And here's what Dr. Blair said. He criticized the media. That's very good. It's always good to start with it. Criticize the media for blaming the country's high rates of obesity on fast food and sugary drinks. Dr. Blair said, you want to pay attention to this one, because this is boldness. Ready? He said, there was, quote, virtually no compelling evidence that in fact is the cause. You ready? So, soda pop and fast food, the technical term for which is crap. Eating large amount of crap has nothing to do with America's overweight problem, according to Dr. Blair at the University of Colorado. What emerged was that he was paid by the Coca-Cola Company. Now, can any of you guess why the Coca-Cola Company would be interested in supporting doctors who believe that you're not fat because you drink 6 cases of soda a day, and that Doritos is how you begin and end each day? And I don't mean to pick on those. I enjoy picking on them, but I don't mean to pick on them. Coca-Cola. This is like VW. They want you to think that the way to deal with your overweight is not to worry about the sugar you take in, the calories you take in, the overwhelming weight of all nutritional science, which says what you put in has something to do with what you got hanging all off of you there. It sort of works that way. No, 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 there's virtually no, according to Dr. Blair, there's, quote, virtually no compelling evidence. Wow. You know, that's, you got to stop, take a breath. That man has got courage. And a big chunk of that $1 million is probably what he also has. And you can bet no Coca-Cola for him. He drinks diet soda. We permit in this country the entities with a grotesque and obvious interest in having you believe a certain way can use all their resources to get you to believe that way that's profitable for them. It's really the same thing as a Department of Defense arranging for a crippled soldier wounded in the war to be paraded at halftime in front of the television, paying the sports team to do this in order to keep the money coming in, with the whole thing presented as though it were an expression of people's feelings about soldiers or veterans or folks who have been wounded and so forth. It's the pollution of what could be an honest and impressive statement. They're not leaving it to that. They're not going to risk it. Just like Coca-Cola isn't going to risk it that a generation of Americans might take it easy on the soda and the Doritos in the hopes of making themselves healthier. They're going to pay to get you not to worry about that, to let you hear from paid informants news that will get you to worry about your problem and solve your problem in the one way that won't eat into their profits. It's everywhere. It's one of the wonderful side benefits of the capitalist economic system. How anyone could be critical of it is beyond me. Immigration, I wanted to say because many of you have asked me. Immigration, the economics of immigration. For most of the last 40 years, as I've talked to you about this repeatedly, American business has basically decided that it can make more money by leaving the United States than by staying here. As Detroit and Cleveland and Camden and umpteen other cities and counties and whole states in this country attest. And that has been true now, as I say, for 40 years. But there always was a second way that corporations could make more money by paying workers less, other than leaving. If you leave, it means you as the business go to where the labor is cheap. There is an alternative, which is to bring the cheap labor here. That will do it too. These are just two alternative ways, and which way a capitalist system goes is just dependent on the circumstances that they can find at any moment in history. Sometimes the way to get this job done, and they have to do it, because enough of them are finding cheap workers that everybody else, to survive competitively, has to do it. The first company that went to China was taking a big risk, but it made so much money that all of its fellow companies had to move to China too, otherwise they would have been wiped out by the inability to compete, given what was being paid to Chinese workers. But the alternative, which was always used to some degree, is to bring cheap labor here. If there's a powerful working class movement of native workers hostile to immigration, well, then the companies will go to where the poor workers are, because it's too difficult politically to bring the cheap laborers in. But if it isn't, if you're having a period of time, which we're in, when the great benefits of globalization, that was the lovely term, that was the bullshit that the economics departments of America developed. The companies going abroad to screw you out of a job and to hire somebody cheaper was redesigned as the globalization. The whole world is integrated. We're all one village. It's poetry. It's also bullshit. It's poetic bullshit, but it's still bullshit. It was all about a lovely veneer over a very ugly venal business. But Americans and others have been turning against globalization, feeling that globalization isn't the blessing it was constructed as, but is a curse, is a threat. No, now how are you going to compete? You can't keep doing it. It's starting to be impossible in this country. It's not just leftists and Democrats, but Republicans. Notice Trump, he gets it in there, you know, he gets it in there. I'm going to make America great. We're not going to see everybody leave. I'm going to cut a deal. It's, of course, bullshit, but you can tell now it's coming from the right and the left. Moving out of the country is not so good. And the big businesses know it. And there's a backlash that's developed. And who knows how far that will go. It's harder even in Europe, where the rules that have been imposed by generations of labor unions, socialist and communist parties make it much harder. Companies cannot leave Germany or France or Italy the way American companies can leave the United States. They have many more restrictions. And they didn't know what to do. And then they figured it out. I'm going to exaggerate now, but not by a lot. Destroy the Middle East. Make it an unlivable part of the world. And millions of desperate people will move in to where we need cheap labor, in Germany, the industrial powerhouse of Europe. That's why Angela Merkel is saying, come on, we'll take 1 million. Whoa, you'll take 1 million. Are the Germans noteworthy as being welcoming to immigrants as opposed to other people? No. Their history is at best on that subject. So let's be honest here. Let's be honest. So why the great welcome of Mrs. Merkel? And she's taking some political risks from this, real ones. Because you don't know, it may turn out, it may in fact, that it'll be more politically dangerous to her to have solved the problem of getting cheap labor by bringing them in than to have loosened the rules to allow German companies an easier time to go out. She may rue the day she shifted, but that's how she calculated, and she had to do one or the other. And she was getting a lot of pressure, as everyone is, to slow down on this globalization. We've used that one up. We've exhausted that one, much juice we can squeeze out of that. Maybe it's time to bring them in. That's the fight here in this country too. It's the Trump build a wall, send them out, deport them all back, close ourselves off, particularly from Latin America where the bulk of folks are coming. Only allow those with a college education to get those special visas that you can get if you have an education and stuff like that, to try to solve the problem. Let American companies go to where they are. We don't want them to come here. That's a powerful political tension. And in each country, that's going to be that's what this is about. The rest is lots of bullshit about our origins as a melting pot. We always let people come here. We didn't always let them. We closed ourselves off from them plenty of times, and virtually every group that came here got the crap knocked out of them by the people who had come here a little bit earlier. It's not a pretty picture. It has not been easy, right? The Mexicans who are now cleaning the dishes and washing the cars across this city and across the country are the latest wave, and they get treated awfully. They're at the bottom of the pile or near it. It's awful. But that's how we've solved a whole lot of problems. And the Europeans have too. And the Europeans kind of liked it. They worked that out for a while. They had this concept, the Germans, in fact, invented it, Gastarbeiter, guest worker in German, guest worker. This was wonderful. For a while it lasted. It was, in the case of Germany, folks, particularly from Turkey, who, when things were tough, would come in Turkey, and good in Germany, would come into Germany and work. They weren't given citizenship for a long time. And so when things turned down, when you had the business cycle that every capitalist economy has, you didn't have to take care of them with unemployment insurance. You didn't have to take care of them with welfare. You just sent them back. They were guest workers, and at a certain point, their welcome was exhausted. Puerto Rico played that role, the United States, for quite a while. They would come when the jobs were here and the conditions were awful there, and then when the jobs evaporated here, they had to go home, which meant they didn't have to get taken care of, at least not at the level they would have here. You may not be aware of it, but the level of social benefits in Puerto Rico is lower than what it is in the rest of the United States, and has been that way for a long time. Now the conditions in Puerto Rico are so bad economically, it's hard for folks to go back. But that's the issue being fought out. It's not about culture, it's not about assimilation. It's fundamentally about how the business community is going to solve the problem of the competitive driving down of wages, either by leaving to go to where the wages are cheap or bringing the low-wage workers here. And what that means for the rest of you who have a job at a reasonable salary, you're going to get it one way or the other. Housing. Housing. I have tried to go over with you on a number of occasions in these sessions how capitalism as a system produces growing inequality of wealth. That used to be a difficult argument for me to get across. It isn't anymore. You've all seen it, you're surrounded by it, and then even the newspapers, the conventional paper, are fairly full of it. You all know that last year, because I've mentioned it several times, a French economist named Thomas Piketty wrote a book, Capital in the 21st Century, became a bestseller both in Europe and in the United States, in which he shows in 600-odd pages how the capitalist system, wherever it has become dominant, has exacerbated the gap between rich and poor, the inequality of the distribution of income. We call that in economics. And that only periodic upsurges of masses of people enraged by the inequality has reversed it for a while or slowed it down for a while, only sooner or later to resume as whatever uprising happened is tamped down or forgotten or fades into history. So I wanted, however, to show you one of the consequences of a growing gap between rich and poor that you may not have seen the connection. And since you've asked me to talk about it, I can make a contribution, I think, here. Whenever this happens, those who gather the wealth into their hands very quickly develop tastes and desires corresponding to what they can afford. It's part of the culture of an unequal distribution of wealth. And one of the first things that happens everywhere is that the rich want to have places that are beautiful, safe, and filled with other people just like them. And what that means in most societies is that they pick particular cities or particular regions of cities, or sometimes whole regions with cities in them, where they begin to concentrate their places of residence, and often also their places of work if they can work it out. That's called gentrification or yuppification. It has a lot of names because it happens all the time. But in a society like ours, where the gap has been growing wider and wider, whole swaths of the United States are largely abandoned to levels of poverty that we haven't seen for 50 years. That's Ferguson in Missouri. Lots of places in Missouri. And lots of other states where you're seeing something that is a level of decay and falling apart of a community the suburbs of St. Louis. It's just stunning what you can see there. And we've mentioned Detroit and Cleveland and all the rest. But here in New York, we're not that. We're the place to which the rich people want to go. And so they come. But this is an island. It's limited. Now, you can make the big tall ones, and boy, are we doing that everywhere, and feeding this concentration of wealth, so that New York City becomes, at least Manhattan, and then now parts of Brooklyn, you all know how that's evolving here, playgrounds for people with the money. There's nothing mysterious here. You just have to understand that as New York and San Francisco and certain other places are where the rich want to be, they're going to push out everybody else. And the economics are perfect. They come in, they all want to live in the lovely place. That means the people who have land or buildings or apartments in the lovely places they want to be jack up the price because they can. And that means all the people who don't have money can't afford it, so they have to leave, leaving the place for somebody with the money who can pay the... There it is. Boom, 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 boom. And the people who aren't are pushed out. If the wealthy want to live in a charming, artistic area with cobblestone streets and all of that, then they'll go there. And within 5 years, it'll look like the places they ran away from. But who cares? There's no logic here that has to do with aesthetics. This is not about culture. This is about the market and the capitalist system's inequality, meaning that those people now want to be with other people like them. And they want to have that nice restaurant to go to that's nearby, and they want to have 400 fitness centers within 12 feet. And they want nail spas, as many as possible, and large numbers of places that will give you, what? Art galleries, and yes, and frozen yogurt places. The things that pass for entertainment. They need those things, and they're going to get them, and they're going to jack up the price, because that's how this, nobody has to organize this. It's the way a market works when you have a tiny number of people, relatively speaking, you know, who, with an awful lot of money, and they want to live where it's exciting. And so if San Francisco, and by the way, what's exciting? That's just whatever the culture has developed to that point, they will go there. And it'll be a little bit of a mystery how it is exactly working. 2 weeks ago, I gave talks in Seattle. And the whole part of the broken down part of Seattle has just been purchased by the Amazon Corporation, which is redeveloping it into a combination condos and stores and fitness centers and all of that, you know, kind of an enclave for all their highly paid executive types. Microsoft and Amazon are powerful players in Seattle, as everybody there explained to me. Boeing is kind of phasing out because it's moving to the American South or out of the country. So it's leaving behind a city that is one of these gentrifying places because folks want to go there. That's what gentrification is, a symptom of a market economy in which inequality is going crazy. And then it becomes almost random what neighborhood. It doesn't matter. It can be a broken down part. You know, you can see it in Brooklyn. Parts of Brooklyn that no one dared to go through, you know, 10 or 20 years ago are now the favored place. The rents go crazy. All the people who live there are on their way out. And, you know, it gets ugly sometimes as various ethnic groups are caught up in this with tensions and all the, or artists who thought they had a studio and now discover they can't afford it. But there's nothing mysterious, and there's nothing, it's not about aesthetics. This is not about people who do or don't appreciate architecture. It really, there's no room for that in this culture. Those who have the money want to be there. And if there's not enough apartments in the old buildings, down they go, and a big glass and steel Hideyoshi will replace it. And we'll all learn to love the wonderful views from the glass-encrusted tomb that we live in. Okay, last thing for today. Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism. Okay, his people are struggling right now as to whether or not he's going to give a major speech, which he has said he will, on what democratic socialism is. He has to do that, in the opinion of many of his advisors, because he's going to be tarred with that brush by the media, who are going to give whatever explanation they have for what the words mean. So if he doesn't get out in front of that and kind of put his stamp on it, then he will just live with whatever the rest of the society calls or thinks those words mean. And given our history over the last 40 years, that's not a good idea, because there's an awful lot of parts of this country where the word socialist is about as bad a thing as you can say about another person or close to it. So I thought it might be interesting for you to just get a quick thumbnail overview of what the term has come to mean. Socialism is old. It predates Marx. For some of you that know that Marx is an important thinker, as for sure he was, but he didn't invent socialism or communism. These things existed, socialism and communism. Marx, as a young man, encountered them and was impressed by them and interested in them, but it was not his invention. Socialism came out of a way of thinking that capitalism was no good. And again, there's nothing surprising about this. Every economic system that the human race has ever had, slavery, feudalism, any of them, has had people who thought it was wonderful and great and celebrated it, and people who thought it was no good. That's just a variety of human experience with everything, with every institution. It's like the example I like to use, some of you may remember. If you want to understand the family that lives up the street, and a mother, father, and 2 kids, and one of the kids thinks it's the greatest family, and they were so lucky to be born into it, and the other one thinks it's a psychological basket case of a family, and you wanted to understand the family, you talk to both of them. You don't find it all that bizarre, do you? Some children reach one conclusion about their family and another. It's not even that one is right and one is wrong, it's that different kids have different ways of dealing with those people called their parents, and we ought to respect it and learn from it. Anyway, capitalism has always had its critics. And for a lot of historical reasons that we don't have to go into, in the early days, I mean the 18th and 19th century when this stuff begins, they took the name socialist. And in the beginning, the socialists were people who didn't like capitalism. They wanted something else, which they ended up calling socialism. Okay? It was a very generalized feeling. It had to do, for example, with people who were angry about poverty. A lot of people imagined when the revolutions that overthrow feudalism happened, the French Revolution in the 18th century, the English revolutions of the 17th century, even the American Revolution. A lot of people imagine that when you got rid of what existed before capitalism and you instituted capitalism, everybody was going to have all they needed and we would all go to the beach. Right? Well, you know, folks are dreamers and hopers, and just as when there were the revolutions that overthrew capitalism, a lot of people in Fidel's Cuba or in Lenin's Russia or in Mao's China thought that now all the good things that had been denied to them in the old system would be accomplished in the new one. And when that didn't pan out that way, they felt betrayed, and so they became critics of the new system. Capitalism had that happen too. Capitalism didn't bring nirvana, so people were critical. So socialism emerged as the critique of capitalism and the notion of how things should be better. But the minute people tried to be concrete about it, they went in all kinds of different directions. Well, what solidified in the 19th century, partly Marx contributed to this, but partly it happened independent of him, was a generalized notion that what was wrong with capitalism was the way property, particularly productive property, land, factories, equipment, how it was owned. Who owned it became a kind of idea that settled in people's minds as dominant. Capitalism, they said, is when private people own it, either by shareholding or they just own the company because they started it or they stole it. It doesn't really matter, but private people own it, and that's capitalism. And socialism would be if you take it away from the private people and you make it the communities as a whole, with the government kind of managing and running it on behalf of everybody. So capitalism is private property in the means of production, and socialism is the alternative, public property. And that was the one idea. The second, and there were only two basic ideas. The second idea, capitalism distributes goods and services. They go from the producer, whoever makes the hamburger or the shirt or the software program, to the consumer, the person who eats the hamburger, wears the shirt, uses the software program, by means of a market. And a market means it's an exchange. I'm going to give you 4 of this. If in exchange, you give me 3 of those. You give me 4 of the dollar bills out of your wallet, and I will give you this drink or whatever it is. We distribute by exchange. So capitalism is private ownership of the means of production and market as the system of distribution. So, for example, if there's a scarce quantity of anything and a lot of people who want it, the way this is going to work out is the people who want it are going to bid for it because there's not enough for everybody. Those then who will get it are the ones who can bid the most. That's the gentrification story we just told you, right? So the market is a system that distributes scarce goods and services to those with the most money. Yikes, said the socialist. That's disgusting. Suppose there's a little baby whose survival depends on getting milk, but the baby has no money, doesn't even wearing anything, and don't have any pockets to put the money in. It has no money, he's going to drop dead of no milk. Meanwhile, a billionaire, having drunk too much last night, now wants some milk to take care of the hangover. He's got all the money, he gets the milk. The socialist said, "That's not right. This is not good. Capitalism is terrible because a market distributes things according to how much money you have, when a decent society would distribute scarce goods according to people's needs, or some calculus of what they deserve, or what the community would like to see as a distribution." So the socialists didn't want market distribution, they wanted planned distribution, with the plan to be governed by the values of the community. So you distribute to everybody equally, or you distribute according to the size of your family, or whatever rules a community. You get the picture? So the socialists wanted the community to own and operate the enterprises, and the community to decide how to distribute things. The capitalists said, no, private people should own and operate enterprises, and we should bargain, all of us, with one another, and that's how things should get distributed. That, for the 19th century, and really up until the 1980s, 70s and 80s, that was it. That was the fight between capitalism and socialism. That's why in the Soviet Revolution of 1917, when the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party took over, what they did was they took industry away from the private owners. Made sense given the discussion. No more private owners. They announced to the private Russian and foreign citizens who owned the industries of Russia, who owned the shares, they said to them very proudly, as of tomorrow morning, these shares you own, we advise you tear them into strips, hang them in the bathroom, and save on toilet paper, because they're not worth any other thing than that use you might make of them. And they closed the stock market. There was no point in having a stock market because your stocks were now worthless. Okay? Made sense in how and they likewise set up something called Gosplan in the Soviet Union. It was the planning agency whose job it was to decide who gets everything that gets produced. You produce the stuff, and then you distribute it according to people's needs or according to what the society wanted. You had planned distribution. And the capitalists went to war against all of this. Social ownership is evil. It's inefficient. It's just disgusting. And planning is worse. The market. That's when we begin to get the market raised to the level of a deity. The market. My students, to this day, say to me, what courses should I take? And I always go, what? Well, what are you interested in? No, they say. What are you talking to me about? What? Where's the jobs? I want to take the courses that will get me the jobs that the market makes of it. The market has been anthropomorphized. This human institution has become something not only not created by us, but it creates us. It's the mirror image, I'm going to take a chance now, it's the mirror image of religion. We create the idea of something we're not, and then rethink the whole thing by making us the product of that, rather than that the product of us. It's magic. Marx loved the similarity. We make the market, that's what the market dictates. Listen to the businessmen and women in this country. Why did you do it? That's what the market dictates. It's like the market talks to you. Well, come on, folks. If Jesus talks to you, the market can talk to you. Right? I mean, come on. If you believe in it, it happens, right? So the businessmen and women, the market is the master. And we will be best off if we do what the market tells us, won't we? Should remind you of religious traditions, because it is a religion, isn't it? It's America's religion. But it's a religion that is built on capitalism. It's the religion of and for and about celebrating private ownership and markets as the best way to heaven. Either heaven elsewhere or heaven here on earth. And the worst thing is to take it away from the private person and give it to the community. What an awful thing. Doubly awful because it sounds good. And to plan, then some bureaucrat will tell you what you can do. That's really terrible to have a bureaucrat tell you. It's much better to have a suit and tied executive tell you. It's really much better. Much better to have Coca-Cola make sure you're fat by telling you that it doesn't matter how much of their crap you drink. Come on, where does this come from? Anyway, the battle between capitalism and socialism was the battle between private ownership and markets, that's capitalism, and government ownership operation and government planning. And socialism was this opposite. And socialism clashed with capitalism, and it reached its kind of peak first in Germany at the end of the 19th century, when that's where socialism really got going. The first big, powerful socialist party was the German Socialist Party in the second half of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, by around 1900, the German Socialist Party was getting about half the votes in the country. It was very, very powerful. Very powerful. But the German march to socialism was interrupted by the explosion in a country where nobody expected socialism to arrive, a backward country, much, much poorer, with very little industry, Russia, 1917. They have an explosion. The mass of Russian people at the time are rural people, are agricultural people. 95% of the people of Russia lived on the farms and did not read or write. So the revolution happened not where people thought it would in the most advanced capitalism, as it produced a working class that said we don't want it anymore. Instead, it happened there, and it gave it a very strange dimension. And they called themselves communists to show they were more militant than the other socialists. They were going to really make it happen and happen quickly. And that made the polarization between capitalists on the one hand and socialists / communists on the other very powerful and very stark. And it produced lots of tension. Countries went to war in gruesome wars World War I was partly about this, but the Russian Revolution really happens at the end of that war. It's World War II where Hitler marches, Hitler the fascist, who's going to save the capitalist world from Bolshevism. That's how Hitler presented himself. And he enters Russia and he's going to destroy Bolshevism. And he marched all the way, as you know, to Moscow, across the middle of Europe, and did unbelievable devastation there. So these were questions of life and death for tens of millions of people, this struggle between capitalism and socialism. And to everyone's surprise, not only did the Russian Revolution happen in 1917, but the Russians defeated Hitler, basically. They pushed him all the way back, and they survived. And then the whole world was caught up after World War II in this great struggle between the United States as the leader of the capitalist world and the Soviet Union as the leader of the socialist world. And again, private property and markets over here, public property and planning over there. That left the Europeans, and indeed many around the world, in a kind of either or, which made them very uncomfortable. And here, this will be now 2 minutes and we'll be done. Socialists didn't like capitalism, but they didn't like the Soviet Union either. They didn't like where it went. It was too much power in the hands of the government, and they didn't like the kind of government that emerged in places like Russia and China too. It was very dictatorial. It didn't have a lot of what socialists kind of thought they were about in making a good and a humane society. So they didn't know, they were caught betwixt and between. They didn't know where to go. So a large number of them carved out a compromise. It wasn't Soviet communism, and it wasn't capitalism. So what they did is they took the parts of the Soviet Union, I'm making this simple, but I want you to get the basic idea. They took the parts of the Soviet Union that they always liked, that the government provided everybody with a free education, that the government provided everybody with medical care, which they did, even in a poor country, that they subsidized the basic necessities of people, that they guaranteed everybody would have an apartment. It may not be a very beautiful apartment, but you're going to get an apartment, and it's not going to wipe you out in terms of the amount of your money that you have to pay for your housing and so on. They liked all of that. They just didn't like the big government and the dictatorial. They didn't want that. They kind of liked the civil liberties and stuff that you had in capitalism, at least in the more advanced capitalist countries. So they said, that's what we want. We want a society that gives people the really good things that those communists and socialists did, and that makes sure that the capitalists can own the stuff, they can run the businesses, because we don't want to give the government that power, and those are the only two options we see. But we're going to hedge our bets by surrounding the private owners of business with so many rules and so many regulations and so many limits that we're not going to let the bad things of capitalism mess us up. The polarized rich and poor, the instability, the gross abuse of the sorts that I catalog for you here every month. And we're going to insist that they fund all the nice things that we get from the social. And that got to be called democratic socialism or social democracy. In Europe, it's more typically called social democracy, but democratic socialism is another term for this. That's why Bernie Sanders, you're not going to hear him say big corporations are anathema and they have to be removed. He's not going to do that. That's part of that compromise. Meanwhile, he's going to say there should be no tuition for college students, they shouldn't be in debt, there should be a national health service, and all of that you're going to get from him, because that's the tradition of trying to carve out something in the middle. It leaves, of course, the basic question. Is that a fantasy? Is it possible to hedge about the capitalists so that you only get the good part? Or will they use their position, their power, and their wealth to undo the very limits you try to put on them sooner or later? The history of the United States is not very promising in this regard. The one time we had a real social democracy, a democratic socialism, the truth of it is is Roosevelt and the New Deal. We did it. We did it. We taxed the crap out of the rich and the corporations, and we used it to take care of the mass of people on a scale we have never done before, but we've never done it since either. And we've been nibbling and eroding all of that for the last 50 years. And the capitalists are the ones who've led the charge to get rid. So it's the question for you as you deal with the phenomena of Bernie Sanders is whether this combination thing, this a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and is that a viable option? Is that something the American people are going to see as worth it? Or is there buried in the consciousness of the American people, and in your minds too, without ever having said it, something like this? In the 1930s, millions of Americans fought like crazy to establish democratic socialism with Roosevelt in the New Deal. They really worked hard, and they got it. They got it. But then it was taken away. Will they fight again if all that the left offers them is a replay? Doing it again, maybe led by Bernie Sanders or someone who comes after him, establishes it again, hedges it, the capitalism, limits it, makes it do good for people, and then watches, because you didn't change the fundamental who runs the businesses, see it be taken away again. First time the people gave it a shot. The American people rose to the task and they did it. The real question is whether they will do that again, or whether they will demand of whoever emerges that you got to come up with a better program than that last one. We're not going to knock ourselves crazy to do what isn't secure, what doesn't last. Especially when you remember that the people most interested in undoing democratic socialism have just had a 50-year experience in how to do it. They're going to do it faster and better next time. They know how. They just learned. It's a very serious and fundamental issue. Folks, we've taken more time than the church allows us. Thank you very, very much.